Welcome, friends from all over in Zoom land. We're very happy that you could join us on a Saturday at a very important time. I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think with uh, political happenings here in the United States, in Europe, and also very positive developments in the region, we may be close to ending the war in Yemen, but we still have quite a lot of work to do. So over the next 90 minutes or so, you're going to hear from a number of fantastic speakers, and you're going to learn a lot about how we can end the suffering of the people of Yemen. I'm Kevin Martin. I'm the president of Peace Action and Peace Action Education Fund here in the US. Welcome to people from all around the US, all around the world, and particularly our friends from the UK. It'll take a few minutes. We've got well over 600 people who are registered, and please feel free to forward the registration link to your friends and family and colleagues. Still time for more people to join. It will take a few minutes for people to stream in, so we'll just give the technology a few minutes. And then I will hand it off to our co-MCs for the day, Aisha Juman, Dr. Juman from Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and Hassan Al-Tayeb from Friends Committee on National Legislation. One of the things you can do using the technology is just put in a little very brief introduction in the chat. Say, hi, I'm so-and-so from Dubuque or wherever you're from, so that we can get a sense of who's joining us today. Aisha and Hassan, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for everybody who is on the call with us today. As Kevin said, my name is Aisha Jaman. I'm with Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. I'm very excited to be on the call with everybody today. We have wonderful speakers who have advocated for peace most of their life and who really care about our shared humanity. So we have an exciting program for everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for being here. I'm Hassan Al-Tayeb at Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quaker Peace Lobby on Capitol Hill here. We've been working to end U.S. participation in the Saudi-led war and blockade in Yemen for a long time. We've made a lot of progress, together as a community, a diverse community led by Yemeni activists, led by progressives, led by conservatives, led by people that care about congressional war powers and care about protecting Yemeni civilians. And I'm just so thrilled for this panel and looking forward to diving in with all of you.
We are gathered today for protests against the war in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. We're here to protest the fact that the U.S. made bombs that have killed innocent people. There have been over 120 armed contracts totaling $120 million a month.
The Saudis have targeted hospitals, schools, food distribution centers, water treatment plants, and have weaponized famine and disease.
85,000 Yemeni children have starved to death.
233,000 people have died.
And 7 million people are malnourished due to the blockade that is enforced and backed by the U.S. Navy.
Gregory Meeks must commit to supporting a war powers resolution to force Joe Biden to act on his promises to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Yemen can't wait! Yemen can't wait! Yemen can't wait! Yemen can't wait!
Thank you very much. We had some of our grassroots all-stars right there in the video who are helping and have been helping to put on this event today. So before we get started, I just want to thank so many people and so many organizations. There are over 30 organizations that are co-sponsoring this. I'm not going to take the time to read all of them right now, but they are listed on the Zoom registration link. And so we're very grateful for all the organizations that have put in so much work on this, and particularly the small planning group, mostly made up of Peace Action, Action Corps, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. And if I'm missing anyone, please forgive me. It's just been a lot to put this together in basically a month or so. So we're about to kick off our program, and I really do appreciate everybody putting their information in the chat so we can see where we're from. One of the people who's helping with behind the scenes tech today is my colleague, John Rainwater, the executive director of Peace Action. And he always likes to stress when we do these things that we shouldn't just call them webinars, we should call them actionars, because we're going to be giving you all kinds of ideas of ways you can take action, particularly in the United States, to put pressure on the US government to end support for the Saudi-led coalition. So throughout, we're going to be putting links in there. We're going to be putting sample tweets. We're going to be showing you different ways that you can participate, including, and this will be later in the program, if any of you are interested in helping to lobby Congress, we're going to be setting up lobby visits on Yemen and ending US support, and also on the new bill, the 502B bill to the resolution to examine Saudi Arabia's human rights. We're going to be giving information about all of that. And if you are so inspired, if you're not already part of a peace group that lobbies on these issues, we would love to have you join us. We'll have that link later in the program. All right, I believe we are ready to get started, and I'm kicking it over to Aisha, I believe, if I have my instructions correct.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very pleased to be introducing to you today Dr. Shireen Adimi. Shireen is a Yemeni American Canadian, and she's a non-resident fellow at Quincy Institute and assistant professor of language and literacy at Michigan State University. Since 2015, she has been a leading anti-war and anti-intervention advocate, focusing on the US participation, assisting the Saudi and UAE-led intervention in her country of birth, Yemen. She has appeared in multiple media, like Al Jazeera, and with the Mahdi Hassan show, NPR. Shireen is a very dear friend, and I've been very fortunate and blessed to have her be part of our movement to end the war on the people of Yemen. Shireen.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and to everybody here who's joined us today. I cannot begin to be, so grateful, begin to tell you how grateful I am for all of the solidarity and all of the support we have felt as Yemenis and Yemeni Americans from all of you. Some of you have very deep connections to Yemen, and others have no idea where it is, or maybe now you knew, or at the beginning you maybe didn't know where it was or what the conflict was, yet you've been with us all along the way. So thank you for taking the time to join us, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this really important event on the 8th year of the beginning of the foreign intervention on Yemen. Wars are really easy to begin, but as each and every single one of us knows, they're very difficult to end, but it's not impossible. Collectively, we've kept this issue alive even when Yemeni suffering didn't garner the worldwide, sustained, and focused attention that it deserved. We mobilized in the streets and online, even when only a few of us knew about this conflict, let alone the US and other Western powers' roles in fueling this conflict. Here in the US, our efforts led to Congress passing its first War Powers Resolution, condemning the sitting president's active and unconstitutional role in the war. And even though the bill was vetoed, our efforts were not wasted. As Muslims around the world begin the month of fasting, let's not forget that millions of Yemenis do not have the option to break their fast at the end of the day. They continue to endure what no human should be forced to endure: hunger, malnutrition, lack of healthcare, water, and a sense of safety. And while tremendous progress has been made over the past year, and Yemenis have not been under bombardment, they're still under a state of war. They're still under occupation. Their lives are still held in the balance, and they're suffering the consequences of years of turmoil. Yet millions remain hopeful that soon the war will end and they can begin to pick up the pieces. So today I'm asking those of you listening the same thing I asked 8 years ago. Let's pressure our governments to end their military involvement in Yemen. Let's urge Congress to take back its constitutional powers and demand an end to US support for this war, no matter the extent, no matter the power, and no matter the party in power. And if you're in Canada, Australia, or any European country who has participated actively in this war or who has sold weapons to the Saudi-led coalition, I urge you to also take up action to condemn your government's military response. Let's demand accountability for those whose lives were cut short, those who've lost their loved ones, and those whose lives were torn apart by this brutal, inhumane war of aggression. Let's keep this issue alive, even if the conditions on the ground look different today than they did a year ago, because the bottom line is Yemenis are still suffering the consequence of foreign invasion and attack. They're still deprived of their most basic human rights, and they're still dying of hunger and preventable illnesses. Please join me in continuing this effort. As long as Yemen is not free from occupation and Yemenis are not free to choose their own destiny, we have the obligation to continue fighting against the injustices imposed on them. Whether you've been fighting alongside us for 8 years or have just learned about our efforts today, I thank you for your solidarity, and I thank all of the members here who have dedicated so much of their time and effort to raise awareness and to push forth political action to end the atrocities in Yemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adini, for your kind words, and also for urging people and thanking them for continuously standing with Yemen. We're at the 9th year right now, unfortunately, entering the 9th year of this horrific war on the Yemeni people. Hassan?
Thank you. Not to deviate from the program, but Shireen is the reason why I'm here today. She first taught me about the U.S. role in the Saudi war in Yemen. She's been my mentor, my guide, and my friend, and I'm so grateful to know her. And really a lot of folks, but she's just played a core role in my journey here. Another person that's played a key role is Senator Warren. And I am so thrilled to be able to introduce her, the senator from my state of Massachusetts. I live in DC now, but I grew up and lived for many years in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and in Boston. And for years, Senator Warren has been on Capitol Hill and has been our fearless advocate and one of our nation's leading progressives, fighting for big structural change to rein in the military-industrial complex and really so much more. There is a lot to say about her work in Yemen. I'm going to try to keep it somewhat brief because I want to jump right into her remarks. But in 2021, folks might remember that she led a 16-member letter calling on the Biden administration to leverage all influence, all tools available, including weapon sales, U.S. military support, and the U.S.-Saudi relationship to make sure that the Saudi blockade on Yemen is lifted as a humanitarian act. Now, let me be clear. Some people don't want to admit that there's a blockade on Yemen because there's been some loosening of it. But there is still, in fact, restrictions, and they're claiming the lives of innocent people. Last year, she was also an original co-sponsor of the Yemen War Powers resolution with Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy. And she's been one of our leading advocates and leading champs in Congress right now to reassert congressional war powers and end the tragic and horrific U.S. role in the Saudi-led war and blockade on Yemen. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Senator Warren for her pre-recorded remarks.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here virtually with you at today's rally. We must bring the war in Yemen to an end. As we mark the 8th anniversary of the war in Yemen, we also mark the deaths and injuries of nearly 20,000 civilians. the displacement of millions of people, and a vast, horrific humanitarian and food insecurity crisis. Far too often, civilians are caught in the crosshairs of conflict and suffer the most. While it was important progress for the Biden administration to end U.S. support for Saudi offensive operations in Yemen and to suspend 2 Saudi arms sales, we can't stop there. We have to push further and bring an end to all blockades that prevent humanitarian aid. I've been glad to support efforts in Congress to end U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, and I will continue to look for ways that we can be supportive in ending this conflict and ending the suffering of the Yemeni people. Iran and Saudi Arabia resuming diplomatic relations may have created a new path for peace. Leadership of organizations like yours are so important in bringing this conflict to an end. And I am glad that you are in this fight as we keep working to end this tragedy and to hold those involved in this conflict accountable.
I love hearing her speak. She's so forceful and really an incredible advocate. And I'm looking forward to continuing the work with Senator Warren. And the fun just is nonstop today. I get to introduce another one of my favorite representatives, Representative Ro Khanna. He's a leading progressive. Many of you already know him, so forgive me if this is repeat information, but I'm going to just say it anyway. He has been our Yemen War Powers champ for a long time and right now represents California's 17th Congressional District, located at the heart of Silicon Valley, and is right now in his 4th term. I hope he has many more. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and has been one of the leading champs on Yemen and human rights and diplomacy for a number of years. His leadership on the WPR in 2017, 2018, 2019 has helped mobilize hundreds of thousands of activists all over the country and helped produce bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate that got the first Yemen War Powers resolution over the threshold of passage through both chambers. That was a big deal. That helped push the UAE to draw down its military forces in Yemen, spurred a reduction in cross-border attacks by the Saudis and the Houthis, led to a Hodeidah ceasefire, and revived negotiations between the warring parties. But unfortunately, as you know, after the veto by President Trump, Yemen suffered a breakdown in diplomacy and an uptick in violence and a continuation of hostilities. But that work was really important. And a lot of the work we're doing right now on this webinar builds on that previous activism that Representative Ro Khanna had such a huge role in shaping. And our work to end U.S. complicity in the Saudi-led war in Yemen is not done. There's nothing preventing U.S. military aid for more Saudi airstrikes, and I'm looking forward to working with Rep Khanna and his amazing staff in D.C. To do more on ending U.S. complicity. And with that, I can pass it to his for his remarks.
Thank you to Peace Action for holding today's event, and to all the groups that have been working so hard to end the brutal war in Yemen. We now have 8 years of this war, and the United States, unfortunately, was complicit. We provided the Saudis with refueling and parts that facilitated their bombing of Yemen. I was proud with Senator Sanders to lead the first War Powers resolution that passed in 2019 to stop the U.S. involvement in Yemen. That led to President Trump voluntarily stopping the refueling, and President Biden then ended any U.S. involvement officially in the refueling of those planes and in offensive weapons for the Saudis. But the war continues. The Saudis must lift the blockade that is not allowing critical humanitarian aid, critical goods and services into Yemen. The Saudis must stop the bombing in Yemen, and we of course need the Houthis to stop bombing as well in a ceasefire. I will continue to fight to end this war, to end any U.S. involvement in the war and to push for the lifting of the blockade. Thank you for your work over the years. This is one of the biggest humanitarian crises, and I appreciate what you're doing to bring the war to an end.
And thank you so much to Rep. Khanna for those remarks. I'm going to pass it to Aisha now.
Thank you, Hassan, and thanks to Khanna also for mentioning the blockade that I call the silent killer of the people of Yemen, because many people are dying in their homes because they don't have either the medicine they need or even the food they have. And actually, the UN has announced this year that the pockets of poverty or famine in Yemen had increased over time, which is expected because the blockade over time becomes even more devastating to the population as resources and things that they need get thinner and thinner over time. I'm now going to be introducing Amani Yahya. Amani is a Yemeni rapper from Al-Hudaydah. Al-Hudaydah is the port where 90% of Yemenis come through that's being blockaded right now by the Saudi-led coalition. She's based in Los Angeles. And as a Yemeni woman rapper, she faces multiple challenges of being a young female rapper in a society that is very conservative. Amani was raised in Saudi Arabia with her father, where he worked, and returned to Yemen in 2010 and made her very first public debut in 2012 at the Basement Cultural Center in Sana'a. So we're going to hear from Amani. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us in person because she fell sick this morning, but she shared something with us.
هيا يا صديق نسير صنعة هالقديمة، خلينا نمشي بعدها لقلعة صيرة، كيف وقع حالها وأصبحت حزينة، صوتها كئيب من بعيد بينادينا نادي فينا، خلينا نتذكر إيش ماضينا، ذكرينا معنى الوطن لعابر الجسور، فوق البحر تحت المطر نصلح الكسور، رجعينا واجمعينا نبني أراضينا. يمنية يمنية يمنية. Hey, you can't hold me back, you can't just keep me out from all the bridges I made it, just look to where I'm at, using pen as a weapon, using art as a blessing, using voice, sharing thoughts, keeping all what's been missing. There's no mystery, go back to the history, read some more, don't ignore, we're not just piece of war, we're not just piece of war. Hey, hey, Yemeniya, Yemeniya.
this was very beautiful and actually quite emotional for me. She's talking about being a Yemeni, and that also wishing for Yemen to be happy again, which is something that we are all here to make sure that that happens. She's talking about how sad Yemen has become. And you saw in the background the beautiful city of Sana'a. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Yemen has a very rich and deep culture. And it's quite heartbreaking to see what's happened to the city and to the country in general. And it's Ramadan now, so those who are fasting, I wish you a blessed Ramadan. I'm fasting as well. And I know that many people in Yemen who are fasting may not even have a meal a day to break their fast, as we heard from Shireen Aladimi on that. And in our work for Yemen Relief, I get heartbreaking stories of hunger and suffering, whether it's a request for medicine or a request for even a meal a day. And it's been very challenging. And I just hope that and know that our work will make a difference. And I also know that those in Yemen who hear and know about our work do appreciate it, because they know they don't have the power or the PR firms to speak on their behalf. They don't have the lobbying that works for them, but your voices represent them. So thank you for bringing their voices to the world and insisting that we do something to stop their suffering. Hassan.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for those words and that amazing music. That was great. I want to get the link. I'm going to download that and listen to it in the car. Does she have more stuff? I'm sure she has more albums and things. So I think everybody should try to follow her on Spotify. I'm about to introduce another one of my favorite representatives, Rep. Ilhan Omar. But briefly, because we have a few minutes before she gets here, I wanted to chat a little bit about something historic that just happened last week. Senator Murphy and Senator Lee last week took an unprecedented step of invoking Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. And I just wanted to explain, I know this is a new tool. It hasn't been used that often. It's never been brought up for a vote. And so we are really at this new moment here that I think everyone should be aware of and what this means for our work on Yemen. This is a privileged resolution in the Senate, which aims to prompt the US State Department to scrutinize and report on Saudi Arabia's human rights practices and its role in the Yemen war. If the Senate Foreign Relations Committee fails to consider the request within about 10 days, the resolution can be brought to the floor by the champs, Senator Murphy and Senator Lee, and they can do a motion to discharge from the committee. And if the resolution passes, that is going to require that the administration within 30 days needs to submit a report on Saudi Arabia's human rights practices in Yemen, but also at home and abroad, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the persecution of dissidents, and we're going to get a full human rights assessment on Saudi Arabia. And those members will then have joint resolutions that they can bring up to the floor to terminate pieces of U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia. And I think this is a really big deal. This did not happen overnight. This is not in lieu of the War Powers Resolution, because that deals with U.S. military support. And 502B deals with the funding piece and some of the weapon sales. They're both absolutely critical. But we're not at this moment, without the support of everybody here. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken action on Yemen. 100,000 people took action on Yemen in December alone. And this work is building up and culminating towards a true end to U.S. complicity. I'm so proud to be with everyone here. And these assumptions are being changed because we keep forcing the question through letters, through votes, through debates, through going on the media. Kevin and Isaac just published an incredible op-ed. That's part of the chorus. Aisha and I have been on countless webinars with Shireen and Massachusetts Peace Action. I could just keep going and going, but really the movement we've built, the bipartisan, the transpartisan movement that we've built is one of the highlights of my entire life so far. And I'm just so thrilled. With that, I am going to introduce, I'm going to start the introduction for Rep. Ilhan Omar, who is right about to join us, and I'm so thrilled to do that. As many of you know, she represents Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Rep. Omar was sworn into office in January 2019, making her the first African refugee to become a member of Congress, the first woman of color to represent Minnesota, and one of the first 2 Muslim American women elected to Congress. In her last 4 years, Rep. Omar has used her position on the House Foreign Affairs Committee to center human rights, democracy, to center humanitarian assistance in conflict-affected areas, disaster-stricken communities, to combat hate, to combat authoritarianism, and to promote international justice. One of her signature efforts has been the Pathway to Peace, a package of 7 bills that would block arms sales to human rights abusing governments, redirect funds from the Pentagon Overseas Slush Fund back to global peace building efforts where it belongs. And she's been a tireless advocate, as many of you know, for ending U.S. complicity in the war in Yemen. She has supported action to end the Saudi blockade on Yemen. She's been an advocate for reasserting congressional war powers and reining in the imperial executive branch. And she's been working to end U.S. participation in weapon sales in the Saudi-led war. And Rep. Omar, I don't know if you're here yet, but I'm thrilled to introduce you. Thank you for your leadership. Know that we are 100% behind you and your team. We know you get too much grief on Capitol Hill, but the people support you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan, for that kind introduction and really just for your support and kindness. Good morning or afternoon to you all. I'm in Minnesota, so it's still morning for us, and happy Ramadan to all of you who are observing. Assalamu alaikum. It is again an honor to be here with you all. It's now been over 7 years since the war in Yemen started. This horrific conflict has sparked the worst human rights crisis in the world, with hundreds of thousands of civilians killed and more than 11 million children still in need of humanitarian assistance. We should be clear, it is encouraging that the ceasefire brokered in April of last year has by and large held. And the recently announced diplomatic deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran presents an opportunity for an end to the conflict. But sadly, we have a long way towards a truly peaceful and stable Yemen. We know that without justice, there can never be peace. And the path to justice lies in the accountability for the crimes committed and the United States' own role in the conflict. Make no mistake, there must be consequences for any war crimes, for any atrocities, and any targeting of civilians in this war. And that's why I recently led a letter calling for the United States to support a UN investigation into the atrocities committed during the conflict, including by the US-backed Saudi-led coalition. It is also critical that we deliver aid to the Yemeni people. 2/3 of the population is still in need of assistance, and many of the countries who actively participated in destabilizing the country are now leaving its people to suffer. More broadly, we must create a lasting, more permanent ceasefire to formally put an end to this war and act as an even-handed broker of a lasting peace rather than a participant in a war. The path to peace will be long and difficult in Yemen, but it starts with accountability. Again, thank you all for your advocacy, for making sure people here in the United States and around the world understand what's happening in Yemen, and for having the care and concern for the Yemeni people. I don't know how many of you know that my mother's family comes from Yemen, and many of them left when the civil war in Somalia happened to go to Yemen, and unfortunately had to come back to Somalia to escape the war in Yemen. And so this cycle for so many people is real, it's painful, and for me, it's personal. So I really do appreciate everyone for advocating for not just a peaceful solution to this conflict, but for accountability and for assistance.
Thank you, Rep. Omar. We really appreciate that, all your words and all your advocacy, and your pressing for accountability, which is so important. So I just speak for all of us when I say, you know, we got your back. We know it's hard on Capitol Hill, but yeah, we're here for you. And with that, I want to pass it to my dear friend Aisha Juman, who's going to line up the next speaker.
Thank you, Rep. Omar, for your beautiful words and for your continuous and support for the people of Yemen. I'm delighted to be presenting now Reverend Liz Theo Harris. My heart always is warm when I see people of faith stand up for what is right. So thank you, Rev. Dr. Liz Theo Harris. The Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris is the director of the Curious Center for Religious Rights and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with the Reverend William Barber too. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Dr. Theo Harris has a long bio and CV, so I'm not going to read all of it. It's in our program, but I'm delighted to have you with us, Dr. Theo Harris.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here in this virtual rally with everybody. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for standing for peace and justice across the world. As we just heard, and throughout this virtual rally, the war in Yemen has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. 337,000 people being killed, and over 16 million on the brink of famine. Staggering more than 20 million people requiring some form of humanitarian assistance just in 2023. 80% of the country's population struggling to access food and safe drinking water and adequate healthcare services, with 3/4, actually 4.5 million of the people being displaced in Yemen, women and children. We know of the multiple emergencies that have, kind of pummeled the country: violent conflict, economic blockade, currency collapse, natural disasters, the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of this has created something that just is not tenable, just is not just, and we need peace. I think there's the basis. I think we're seeing the basis for de-escalating, ending this conflict in Yemen, with the hopeful sign that Saudi Arabia and Iran have restored relations. We must apply pressure in this moment for peace. Let's use this opening to apply pressure for peace, a peace that is so desperately needed. Sitting from where I am, we just observed the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War with the U.S. We're just over a week before the anniversary of both the death of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but also the anniversary of Dr. King coming out and connecting the evils of racism and poverty and militarism in this country with those problems across the world. It's just the day after the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. And in this moment, in the season of Ramadan, in the season of the Christian season of Lent, we must turn away from violence. We must turn away from sanctions. We must turn away from war and all ways that are bringing the life and livelihood of people, especially women and children, down. I think about a poster that was hung in my house growing up that said that war is not healthy for children and other living things. And we know this to be true. So we must be inspired in this moment by the words of Reverend Dr. King and others who talked about a cruel manipulation of the poor when we have war across the world, poor people fighting poor people when the rich just get richer. So in a society like the US that spends more on weapons of war, that approaches spiritual death when we do so, we are calling for a moral revolution of values, a moral revival of love and truth and justice and peace. Peace, peace. We stand in solidarity with the people of Yemen. And as we say in our campaign, not forward together and not one step back. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for your wonderful, wonderful world and connecting the suffering of so many people in so many different places. You mentioned something which is also the sanctions that especially the US uses against many countries in the hope that these countries will change their leadership. In fact, these sanctions actually only hurt the civilian populations of these countries. So I hope that we also work against all sanctions in all countries. Thank you again. Hassan?
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you, Reverend. Incredible and beautiful remarks. My honor now to introduce Representative Rashida Tlaib. She is a well-known progressive warrior and, in her own words, a mother working for justice for all. Her two sons are at the root of her passion to help change lives for the better, here in the US, in Palestine, in Yemen, and all over the world. She's the oldest of 14 children, born and raised in Detroit, and the proud daughter of Palestinian immigrant parents. I first met Rep. Tlaib about 6 weeks after she got sworn into office in 2019. I was so impressed with her. I told her about Saudi-led war in Yemen. I told her about US weapon sales. I told her about the famine. I told her about the children that were suffering. And unlike any other member I've ever spoken to, she paused and she started weeping right there in the meeting in front of me. I will never forget that day. And that is just who she is and who she continues to be. She has not let me down for a second on Capitol Hill. And I'm just so thrilled to know her and her staff. She came out to, meet Iman Saleh as she was doing a hunger strike on the front steps of the White House. She's always there when you need her and when you need her to speak out for human rights. Speaking of Yemen, she just led a humanitarian aid letter in support of more assistance for Yemen. There had been a pretty large and sizable cut by the Biden administration for Yemen, and she's working with her colleagues, 24 of them in the House, to get that number up to $1.2 billion in funding as a down payment on emergency relief. And she wants those funds not just to be directed towards, charity and food baskets, which are important too, but she wants long-term economic opportunities for Yemenis. And I think it's absolutely critical. Yemen, this is how we stop the war paradigm, is when we get long-term economic opportunities. That starts with lifting the blockade, but it also starts with, directing our humanitarian aid where it needs to go to support these Yemenis in need. So with that, I'm going to pass it. I keep saying we're going to pass it, but She's not here. It's a pre-recorded video that we're very excited to see.
Salams, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and I want to thank Friends Committee on National Legislation for putting together this important event and for all of their amazing work. I am proud to be here today in solidarity with countless Yemenis here in the United States and across the globe, as we all remain strong in our fight to end the war in Yemen. The bombings of civilians, including hospitals, schools, and water treatment plants, are clearly war crimes and crimes against humanity. The United Nations has already described this as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, as millions of Yemeni people face famine. The United States must do more to end the air and the sea blockade into Yemen. These restrictions on aid and essential goods are killing more of the civilians than the bombs are. On my end, I am working hard to ensure that the U.S. fights to preserve the current ceasefire and expand on these hard-fought diplomatic victories wherever possible. And while I'm disappointed in the lack of action from the State Department and the Biden administration to live up to its mission to protect the Yemeni population from human rights violations, I remain hopeful that our movement in Congress to end this war is growing. I am proud that I have led 23 of my colleagues in calling for at least $1.2 billion in humanitarian assistance to Yemen in this year's budget. But none of these efforts would ever be possible without the incredible activists and advocates and everyday people like yourselves fighting for Yemen. I know this has been a long road that sometimes seems like it goes forever, but we will end this war, and your continued efforts are key to that. So thank you, and again, you will always have a fighter and an advocate in the United States Congress.
Well, thank you, Rep. Tlaib, and thank you to her amazing staff in DC and back at home in Michigan. I wanted to speak momentarily about the importance of advocacy in moving the needle on really important issues like the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I've seen this firsthand, going back to what Shireen said early on. A lot of people weren't really thinking about Yemen. It wasn't covered in the news. It wasn't being talked about on Capitol Hill, but dedicated activists kept the needle moving and kept pushing lawmakers, kept talking to the reporters, writing LTEs, pushing out op-eds, making coalitions, doing advocacy, lobbying Congress. And it has made an incredible difference, really. The movement that we've built together is really a force to be reckoned with, and something that's changed the lives of millions of people in a real way. Aisha can speak to that. Shireen can speak to that, but we are just so grateful to all of you for being here with us. We urge you to take action. We urge you to get to know your lawmaker, schedule a lobby visit. Say, what are you doing about the U.S. role in the war in Yemen? What are you doing to, make sure that restrictions on movement and access aren't killing innocent Yemeni civilians, that medicine can get through the ports, that people that need emergency medical treatment can leave out of Sana'a Airport when they need treatment and not when it's too late. So thank you so much for your activism. We want to keep it going. We're not stopping here. We're just warming up. We are not going to let this go. And they might want us to let it go, but we're not going to let this go until we truly end the U.S. role in this war, the military role, I should say, and that we push the warring parties to the negotiating table to finally lift the restrictions on movement and access and humanitarian aid until we finally get a peace deal that brings this war to an end. And with that, I can pass it on to Aisha.
Thank you, Hassan. I just want also to share and support what Hassan said. We are working against a lot of money. We're working against lobbyists. We're working against PR firms. We are working against media, very strong media in support of the Saudi-led coalition because they have a lot of money. Many of us working in this area are actually volunteers. Yet, we have been able to pass a Yemen war power resolution in 2019. We have been able to keep the momentum on and the pressure on not just the US government, the British government, the Canadian government, the Italian government, the German government, and the French government. And it's all because your voices are very important. I always remind myself that the politicians in the US that I vote for, I'm their constituent, and they respond to me, not to the lobbyists that are lobbying on behalf of Saudi Arabia. So your voices are very, very important in the work that we are doing. It's now my pleasure to introduce Chris Nineheim. Chris was an extreme ally and advocate and supporter of our work, and partnered with us 2 years ago to also demand an end to the war on Yemen. Chris is a political activist and founding member of the Stop the War Coalition and is currently a vice chair. He served under Jeremy Corbyn from 2011 to 2015. He was one of the organizers of the 2 million February 15, 2003 demonstration in London, and central to the international coordinated efforts that led to the protests globally. Thank you, Chris, for all the work that you do to bring peace to our world. It's people like you that really keep us safe. So I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aisha, and thanks to everyone for organizing this fantastic event and for all of your campaigning over the years. And I think it is an enormous relief that there has at last been some progress towards peace in Yemen. But as others have said, there remains so much to do on the issue. One thing is continuing to campaign over the isolation and the blockade of Yemen. There's clearly a continuing humanitarian catastrophe that needs to be dealt with. But I also think there needs to be some truth-telling and reckoning here, because it is not just that the West has been complicit in the war on Yemen. In my opinion, the reality is that the disaster in Yemen could not have happened without the enormous backing by successive US governments, British governments, and other governments in the West for the attack. There's been a Oxfam report that came out earlier this year, which particularly focuses on the British government's involvement, but goes through in detail the extent of the catastrophe. According to this report, 39% of all Saudi attacks forced civilians to lose their homes. The report records an absolutely devastating level of destruction to Yemeni infrastructure as a direct result of the invasion and the attack and the military follow through, including, it's worth remembering, numerous direct hits on hospitals, on clinics, on ambulances that this Oxfam report regards as being direct and deliberate war crimes. I think all this is important because, first of all, there is every danger that this war could restart. I don't think that the diplomatic processes that are taking place at the moment are anything like resilient enough to ensure peace. I think there's also continued danger if the US and Britain and other Western allies continue their current policies in the Middle East. There is a danger of further proxy wars breaking out and further Western involvement in the region. I also think it's important that we learn lessons from this war around the question of the hypocrisy of US and Western foreign policy. At the moment, our governments and media are absolutely obsessed with pointing out, in particular, the war crimes, the very real war crimes of Vladimir Putin in his invasion of Ukraine. They are constantly calling out the Iranian government. They are ramping up a kind of hostile rhetoric against the Chinese regime and so on. All this at the very same time, all these developments have taken place at the time when they have been backing the authoritarian regime in Saudi Arabia, one of the most vicious regimes in the world, at the time when it has generated the biggest humanitarian catastrophe through its pursuit of the war in Yemen. And this isn't just a question of calling out double standards. I think this is a question of understanding that the policy that is being pursued by governments on both sides of the Atlantic in various different war theatres is not driven by humanitarian concerns. It's not driven by some consideration about the rights or the democratic possibilities and futures of various people around the globe. It is deeply cynical. It is based on power projection. It is based on an assessment and a absolutely resolute pursuit of corporate interests by our governments. And I think that's a lesson that we have to draw from this terrible sequence of events. And I want to end by saying that we're meeting in the week which marked the 20th anniversary of the catastrophic invasion of Iraq by the US and Britain in particular. And it seems to me that that was an event that generated many of the problems that we face, and particularly the people of the Middle East face today. And the kind of unfolding events in the Middle East need to be understood in the context of that invasion. I also think that one of its legacies, and a slightly more hopeful legacy, has been the generation of anti-war opinion across the West and anti-war activism and anti-war organization. And I think we should take some credit here and understand that over the last 2 decades, we have made some difference. If you read the internal documents where the Western powers are considering their next interventions and considering their military options, time after time, they do pay attention. They do take into consideration domestic public opinion, by which partly they mean the anti-war mobilizations that have taken place. And I think we need to take some heart from that fact. And as the situation in the Middle East continues to be extremely tense, as the US ramps up its hostility and its military mobilization against both the Russian regime and the Chinese, I think it's very important that we do take some heart and some hope from what we've achieved already, because we have to strengthen the anti-war movement. We have to keep mobilizing. We now face the possibility of big power confrontation between NATO and Russia, between NATO powers and China, obviously all nuclear armed powers. And I think we have to draw from this experience the need, amongst other things, the need to strengthen our networks, strengthen this kind of international coordination, but also build anti-war organization and anti-war mobilization in every town, in every city, in every trade union, in every workplace, in every university, right across the world, because our futures are challenged, I would say, by the continuing drive to war.
Thank you very much, Chris. You also mentioned something that is extremely important, is how the advocacy really result in change in how governments behave. The truce that's going on now in Yemen that started in April is actually a result, in my mind, of all the work that advocates have been working on. So it's been wonderful to see that our work had resulted in some peace, relative peace for the people of Yemen. And I agree with you 100% that we need to stop wars before they happen. And that we need to strengthen the anti-war movement and make it, everywhere. I'm hopeful that people, especially young people, Generation Z, are more interested in peace and have shown that they are going to be working on that a lot more. So hopefully that will be something to look forward to. And I'll pass it to Hassan. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Aisha and Chris. spot on. Yes, let's build this international peace movement. This webinar is a piece of that, but more to come. And speaking of more to come, I want to introduce Rep. Pramila Jayapal. She was elected in 2016. She's now serving her 4th term in Congress representing Washington's 7th District. She is the first South Asian American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and one of only 24 naturalized citizens currently serving in the U.S. Congress. She has really been a champ on so many issues, foreign and domestic, as chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and we really are so grateful for her leadership. Her work on Yemen has been really tremendous. She was one of our co-sponsors last year on HJ Res 87, the Yemen War Powers resolution on the House side. She had supported 3 successful NDAA provisions through the House to end intelligence sharing, spare parts, maintenance, logistics support, and all aspects of U.S. military complicity in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. I'm really grateful to her, and I'm really grateful to her staff who have been behind the scenes really on so much of what you see. You just see a letter, you see a tweet. These members are very busy, and a lot of times the staff are doing that grunt work and behind the scenes work, and they really are true fighters for ending the U.S. role in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And with that, we can pass it to Rep. Jayapal for her remarks.
Today marks a solemn anniversary. 8 years ago today, Saudi Arabia's devastating war in Yemen began. I want to thank FCNL for gathering us on this occasion and for your committed and relentless advocacy to keep the cause of ending this war front and center. Today, it is still the site of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, affecting more than 22 million people. Saudi Arabia's airstrikes and air and sea blockade have cost hundreds of thousands of lives and threatened millions more with famine. Saudi airstrikes escalated in 2022, killing and injuring 4 times more civilians than in 2021. There are more than 17 million Yemenis living in hunger and more than 2 million children suffering from acute malnutrition and on the brink of starvation. More than 80% of the population, including more than 9 million children, lack access to safe drinking water, sanitation, and adequate health services, which has led to spikes in cholera, diphtheria, measles, and other preventable diseases. After nearly a decade of fighting, 4.5 million people are displaced, and access to health centers and schools has deteriorated. A UN-backed truce lasted from April to October of 2022 and provided brief relief from this onslaught, while Saudi airstrikes, which rely on U.S. military participation, have not resumed. The people of Yemen still live at imminent risk of violent escalation by the warring parties. And while there has been some loosening, an inhumane Saudi-led aerial and naval blockade continues to limit travel and prevent the free flow of food, fuel, and medical supplies from entering Yemen. Houthi forces have committed grave human rights violations in Yemen and launched cross-border attacks in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. These actions have escalated the conflict, and we fully condemn them. But violations by Houthi forces do not serve as justification for enabling Saudi-led abuses and collective punishment against civilians, which have perpetuated the conflict and will continue spurring escalation and violence. As long as the United States is providing military support to Saudi Arabia, the American people's tax dollars are helping to finance this crisis. We cannot enter the 9th year of this deadly conflict complicit in the Yemeni people's suffering. Another reality for the Yemeni people is possible, one where families and communities can live together and children can go to school, where food, fuel, and medicine can flow freely into the country, where there can once again be life in Yemen without hunger, without thirst, without the threat of falling bombs. I know that that is the dream of the millions of people of Yemen, and progressives will not let up until their dream becomes a reality.
Thank you so much, Rep. Jayapal, for those powerful remarks and for all your work on ending U.S. complicity in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Aisha Juman for more.
Thank you, Hassan. I want to welcome MP Jeremy Corbyn, who joined us now, but I'll be introducing Dr. Perello Freeman first, and then we will be inviting MP Jeremy Corbyn to speak as well. So our next speaker is Sam Perello Freeman. He is a research coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade in the UK. His current main focus is on UK arms exports and political influence of the arms industry on UK government policy. His other areas of expertise include data on world military expenditure, arms industry and trade, and corruption in the international arms trade. Sam has, again, a very extensive bio and CV. Please go and read on that. I want to give him a chance to tell us about his work. Thank you, Sam, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to speak and for organizing this amazing online rally. After the US, the UK is the biggest supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia. About half of the aircraft they used to bomb Yemen are British Tornado and Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft, some delivered even after the start of the war. With them go the bombs and missiles they fire and the ongoing maintenance and support required to keep them flying. As with the US, the Saudi Air Force could not keep flying without this crucial support, and their war machine would grind to a halt. While the Biden administration has at least stopped the supply of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia, the UK has done no such thing, and in the first 9 months of 2022 alone, licensed nearly £1 billion worth of bombs and missiles to replenish the Saudi arsenal. Since the start of the war on Yemen, the UK has sold £27 billion, $33 billion worth of arms and military services to Saudi Arabia. BAE Systems alone have made £22.5 billion in revenue since 2015 from this, and have 6,700 employees there supporting the Saudi Air Force. Aircraft filled with spare parts and equipment regularly fly out to Saudi from BAE Wharton in Lancashire, England. The UK has export control laws that should, in theory, prevent the sale of weapons that cause such devastation to civilians. One clause says that a license shall not be approved if there's a clear risk that the arms might be used to attack civilian targets. That this is happening ought to be blindingly obvious. This is why Campaign Against Arms Trade has taken the UK government to court to try to overturn the government's decisions on arms sales to Saudi. We won the first time round in 2019 in the Court of Appeal, when the judges declared the government's decision process to be irrational and unlawful. But the government shamefully found a way to wriggle round this, claiming that any violations by the Saudi military were isolated incidents. So we launched a second lawsuit, and we're back in court in January for round 2 and await the verdict. Whether or not the judges conclude that the arms sale decisions are illegal, which is a high bar to prove, we believe and will continue to argue that they are clearly wrong and have been the cause of horrific harm to the Yemeni people, doing nothing to bring peace. Whatever the judges say, the government could and should stop them tomorrow. The US and UK, between them, have the power to stop the Saudi war on Yemen once and for all. I urge you to take action to demand they do so, And if you are in the UK, please join CAT at the links I've just posted. But ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia will not on its own bring peace and justice to Yemen. Our governments and others must do much more. The Saudi blockade must be ended. Aid must be increased. The UN's fundraising drive for Yemen fell drastically short of what is needed this year. There must also be serious efforts for accountability in Yemen. All parties to the conflict, the Saudi coalition, the Houthis, government forces, southern separatist forces and others have committed egregious violations of human rights with impunity. In 2021, Saudi lobbying led to the end of the UN's group of eminent experts on Yemen, the only international body investigating violations by all sides. Our governments must work within the UN to create a new mechanism to provide accountability and redress for the people of Yemen. Finally, diplomatic efforts for a just and inclusive peace, involving all Yemeni groups, women and civil society, as well as armed groups, must be redoubled. This is no easy task, but the US and the UK, who have done so much to fuel this horrific war, must do whatever they can to end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. You're absolutely right. The war contribution of the US and the UK, without them, the war wouldn't have started, and without them, the war would not have continued for 8 years now. And so as citizens of the UK and the US, we need to pressure our governments to end their support for the war. And as you said, there's going to be a lot more work to be done once the war stops. One is, like you said, we need to make everybody accountable, especially for war crimes committed, but also rebuilding the lives of the people of Yemen. As far as the blockade, I think it's extremely important that it needs to end now and not wait or be used as a bargaining chip during the negotiations. Thank you very much. Kevin, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Aisha. Kevin Martin from Peace Action jumping back in. And I didn't really want to be an MC or introduce anybody until we found out that our next speaker would join us. I'm going to spare you the long resume because it's very impressive. You can read it on the Zoom invitation. I'm just going to say that Jeremy Corbyn is one of the most thoughtful, caring, sensitive politicians I've ever had the privilege of meeting in my career for a long time. And of course, his rejuvenation of the Labour Party when he became leader and leader of the opposition in 2015 is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in politics. I remember my reaction. I was like, Corbyn is going to be Labour Party leader? No way, he's too good for that. And he was spectacular and continues to serve his district in Parliament since 1983. And it's been a long time since I've seen you, Jeremy, but I'm so glad you're here with us today. Thank you.
Kevin, thanks very much for that lovely introduction. And it's an absolute pleasure to be on this call. I didn't catch all of the speeches that have gone before because I've been at doing stuff in my local community this afternoon, dealing with the issues that directly affect people on housing and poverty and all the other things that are very brutal government causes for them. The war in Yemen is probably the worst humanitarian disaster in the world at the present time. And if you look at the numbers of conflicts that are going on around the world that are barely reported at all, you begin to wonder why. Obviously, the war in Ukraine gets huge levels of reporting, and obviously the tragedy of deaths and refugees and the deaths of conscripted soldiers gets a lot of reporting. Other conflicts around the world, for example, the conflict in West Papua doesn't get much coverage or much reporting at all, even though it is a very serious post-colonial conflict is about raw materials and is also about arms sales, where Britain is supplying arms to the Indonesian government. I give those two as an example because I think it's important that in challenging the whole narrative about Yemen, we also understand we have to challenge the whole narrative about arms sales and the notions of leadership in the world. And I was very impressed with the contribution made by Sam from Campaign Against Arms Trade about the amount of money that has been made by British Aerospace, BAE Systems on sales to Saudi Arabia, but also sales to United Arab Emirates and other countries within the region. Broadly speaking, almost 400,000 people have lost their lives in the war in Yemen. That is more than any other conflict in recent times. Then you add up other conflicts such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and you begin to see this massive death toll that is going on. UK arms sales directly to Saudi Arabia run into billions, but it's also the ongoing income that British Aerospace get from Saudi Arabia for maintenance and delivery of the weapons and the war that's going on. And yet there's something slightly odd that Britain, the UK, was the pen holder for the writing of a UN ceasefire resolution at the same time as Britain was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, arms supplier to Saudi Arabia, which of course was prosecuting the war in Yemen. Additionally, Saudi Arabia consumes 23% of all US arms exports in the whole world. And so this is a massive income that is to the US and to British companies for the supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia, the results of which are hundreds of thousands of dead, over 20 million people affected, very large numbers of children living in desperate poverty, and wholly preventable diseases breaking out and taking further life and reducing life expectancy. And so the ceasefire that was eventually agreed is obviously welcome, because anything is better than the shooting and killing of people. And that ceasefire was then enhanced, I suppose is the way to put it, by the agreement reached between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which China brokered. And I welcome the fact that that agreement has happened, because it does give the opportunity in the space for a long-term peace for the people of Yemen. But what I see here is a beginning of a change in the whole concepts of what is leadership around the world, because there has to be an understanding that leadership ought to be the eternal search for peace, ought to be the eternal search for justice, ought to be the eternal search for environmental sustainability and a sustainable environment for the future for all people, both economic and in the ecological sense as well. And so the support for a peace process in Yemen is important and is huge. And I absolutely salute those such as Aisha in the US Congress and various colleagues of mine in the UK Parliament that have been prepared to consistently raise this. But I have to say this, when you start calling for a ban on arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the effect in Yemen, a whole lot of other forces rapidly come into play and start condemning the individual that has made that call. And so it does require some degree of political determination and strength to keep up with that demand. But a ceasefire is no more than that. It isn't peace. It isn't a solution. It is, as it says, a ceasefire. It's an end to temporarily the shooting that's going on. That must now be followed up with a longer term peace process in which the people of Yemen as a whole decide their own future, decide their configuration of their country, and decide its relationships with other places. But it also requires that the rest of the world rapidly provide the urgent medical, food, and technical aid that is needed in order to repair the infrastructure, prepare the education system, repair the health system, and provide Yemeni people with some hope for the future. There are Yemeni refugees all around the world. There are quite a number in this country, and I'm sure there are in the USA and other places as well. And I have to say, and I say this with a sense of shame on this country, that we have done the right thing by Ukrainian refugees. They're provided with support as soon as they arrive. They're given the right to work as soon as they arrive, and they're very much welcomed into our society. And I absolutely endorse and work with them on that. But we're now putting legislation through the British Parliament which criminalizes people who attempt to enter this country by boat from France, and they are desperate people from conflicts all over the world. And the lack of support for refugees from the war in Yemen, of Palestinian people, of Eritrean people, of Syrian people, of people from Libya, or indeed any other war-torn country, is an absolute disgrace. And so part of our demands must be full support for refugees coming from this war. And the last thing I'd say is this. We've got a great call here this afternoon. It's fantastic to see so many people on it, and fantastic to see that at last the issue of Yemen is beginning to come a bit more center stage. We need to ramp it up even more, a great deal, to get that aid there, to get that long-term peace, but also develop an understanding that the colonial occupations of the past, the colonial partitions of countries of the past, and the way in which they were partitioned up by dividing up communities, dividing up faith groups, or indeed grabbing of natural resources, is very much at the heart of this. So it does require a much better understanding of the history that have often brought about these conflicts, and the way in which the arms trade does so very, very well out of all these conflicts. So I think we have to understand the power of the arms lobby, the power of the arms trade, the money that is made out of it, but also the resources, the technical resources it sucks up, which could do so much more to bring about decent healthcare around the world, environmental sustainability, and decent standards of living for all. We have to never give up on redialing the process to build a world of peace and of justice based on human rights and survival, rather than the eternal search for war and conflict. And that means it's the citizens' voice, it's our voice, the voice of the peace movement that must be heard, not the voice of those that are making a great deal of money out of these conflicts through the sale of arms. Thank you very much for organising this, and thank you very much. I feel very, very honoured to be invited to take part in this discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Jeremy, or as I would like to call you still, Leader Corbyn, because I don't care what the Labour Party says your title is within the party, you're always a leader to many of us. So we want to actually pick up on something that Jeremy just said. We've been putting in the chat various possibilities for you to take action supporting the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, tweeting at your member of Congress. And we have the opportunity coming up very soon to lobby members of Congress. Those of you who haven't been part of lobbying Congress before, or you're not part of a local peace group, still please sign up. We will give you the resources and the training needed, and the timing couldn't be better. We think and hope that there will soon be a war powers resolution introduced in the House and Senate, but also the 502B resolution to spotlight Saudi Arabia's horrible human rights record and how that could impact US military aid to Saudi Arabia going forward. So the timing of this rally, which of course was to coincide with the anniversary of the Saudi bombing 8 years ago, also is very important politically in terms of what we can do here in the United States, what people can do in Britain and other countries, and also the positive developments that several have noted, including Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablishing their diplomatic ties. We're almost at our time, and I know there were so many good questions in the chat. I don't think we're going to have much time to get to them. I think a lot of them have been addressed by our fabulous speakers. If any of our speakers who are still on wanted to say just a quick word or two before we sign off, otherwise, I really want to thank Aisha and Hassan and everybody who helped produce this terrific event. Any of our speakers want to just throw in another minute or two? Any comments you are thinking of now that you had forgotten before? Thank you, Chris, plugging the website. Okay, Aisha or Hassan, did you have anything you wanted to help take us out with? Any last words?
Yes, I want to thank everyone who was with us today, the speakers, the people who joined the event as well. I also want to reiterate what everybody is saying, that our voices count and that we need to make our governments accountable, and that they actually do listen to us, and we need to continue the pressure. The Yemeni people have endured horrific atrocities for 8 years now. I also need to say that it's very important not to hold the Yemeni people hostage through the blockade for negotiations. The blockade is a war crime, and we need to ensure that people understand that, and that our politicians hear from us about this. Again, I remember when I started my advocacy work in Seattle, when the war started in 2015, I felt so lonely going to speaking engagements. And it's so wonderful to be part of such a larger community. And I hope we continue to do our efforts to bring peace, not just to Yemen, but to everywhere, and prevent wars, especially as rhetoric for war is picking up, unfortunately. Thank you all very much. Hassan?
Thank you, Aisha, my teacher and my guide here. I've learned so much from you, and I've learned so much from this community. We have a huge and historic opportunity this year to get this done, to try to finally end U.S. participation in the war. There is probably going to be a vote in the middle of April on the 502B resolution that we've been chatting about. And that's going to require a full, transparent human rights report by the State Department. And then that opens up the question of U.S. military assistance. That is coming down the pike right now. So we need folks on this call to sign up for a lobby day. The Peace Action link is absolutely critical. Get plugged in. Let's get this over the finish line so we get the report. And then there's going to be follow-up steps, for joint resolutions to potentially block some of the weapon sales, private contractors, all these things that keep these Saudi warplanes in the air and open up the opportunity for more bombing and shelling of Yemen. And as long as Saudi Arabia can lean on the United States and the United Kingdom, they aren't going to be as motivated to get to the peace table. And so that's why our voices are absolutely critical. The Saudi-Iran rapprochement is definitely an important step, but there are people that do not want to see peace in Yemen right now. And we have to take action to make sure that they don't win and that we finally lift the blockade, get emergency humanitarian aid to the people that need it, and make sure that not a single US bomb or United Kingdom bomb gets dropped on Yemen ever again. And with that, I am so grateful for the hundreds of activists that have been here with us on the Zoom call and the hundreds more that have been streaming live all across the country. Thank you, Peace Action, Kevin, Lily, Haley, so many people I want to thank, but I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you, everyone. And let's stay in touch and stay engaged, because Yemen can't wait. Thank you all.
Thank you, Hassan, Aisha, and Peace Action. Really great stuff.